She was just dancing in her kitchen. That's all she was doing. Bare feet on cold tile, headphones on, completely unaware that the most guarded man in Los Angeles was standing at his floor-to-ceiling window, 20 feet away across a courtyard, watching her like she was the first real thing he had seen in years. He didn't move. He didn't look away. And when she finally spun around and the light caught her face, that wide, unself-conscious smile aimed at no one in particular, something inside Dae-Hyun Nam cracked open. Something he had spent a decade burying under board meetings, acquisition deals, and the slow, disciplined extinction of his own longing. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that she was a dancer who paid her rent 3 weeks late every month and kept a dream journal she'd been filling since she was 19. He didn't know about the scar on her confidence that her last relationship had left behind, or the company she was quietly, furiously building from nothing. And she had no idea that her neighbor, the one she saw exactly twice a year, always in a suit, always moving like someone being chased by a deadline, was standing in the dark watching her like she was water after a decade in a desert. This is the story of what happened when two people, shaped by entirely different worlds, kept ending up in the same place at the same time, and what it cost them both to finally stop pretending it meant nothing. If this story gets under your skin, the way it got under mine, hit subscribe. We release new stories every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. And drop a comment below. Do you think Dae-Hyun deserves a second chance? Let me know, because this story is going to make you feel some things about that question. Los Angeles in late October had a particular quality to it, a light that felt borrowed, golden and slightly unreal, like the city was performing the idea of autumn without committing to the cold. The Harlow was a 12-story residential building in Silver Lake, the kind of property that looked like it belonged to someone with very particular taste and absolutely no need to explain it. Nam Capital Group had acquired it 4 years earlier as part of a larger portfolio. A clean asset, strong rental yield, the kind of building that held its value quietly and without drama. Its owner occupied the penthouse on the 12th floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, a private terrace that overlooked the whole of Silver Lake, and a view of Los Angeles that on clear nights made the city look like something worth having. Below him, 11 floors of tenants who had no reason to know his name, a semi-retired music producer on the 9th floor, a pair of grad students who seemed to subsist entirely on espresso, and conviction on the 4th eye, and on the 7th floor, a woman who had lived in apartment 7B for 11 months without ever learning his. Noelle Kingston had moved into 7B in December of the previous year, 28 years old and newly freed from a 3-year relationship that had quietly convinced her she was too much, too loud, too expressive, too committed to a life that didn't come with a salary plan. She had packed 2 suitcases, her portable bar, and enough determination to fill the rest of the space. The apartment was small by most standards. By hers, it was a universe. She had painted the kitchen wall a deep terracotta. She had hung her mother's photographs along the hallway. She had dragged a second-hand sofa to face the window and declared it perfect, even though one cushion was perpetually threatening to slide off. She had made it entirely, defiantly hers. By October, she had a rhythm. She taught contemporary dance 3 mornings a week at a studio in Echo Park, took every freelance performance gig she could find, and spent her evenings working on the business plan for what she called, only in her journal, only to herself, the Kingston Project, a small independent dance company that would be hers, built from the ground up, no compromises, no apologies. She was 29 now. She had given herself until 30 to make it real. The dancing in the kitchen happened on the nights when the stress got too loud to think through. She'd clear the small table to one side, put on whatever song was living in her chest that week, and just move. It wasn't choreography. It wasn't performance. It was the oldest form of self-conversation she knew. She never thought about the windows. Why would she? The building's inner courtyard, narrow, lined with potted olive trees, opened upward like a well, and most nights the floors above her were dark or curtained. The penthouse, 12 stories up, was so far above her that she had never once thought to look. On the night of October 14th, She put on a slow, aching R&B song she had found at 2 a.m. the week before and couldn't stop playing. She closed her eyes. She started to move. She didn't know that the penthouse was, for the first time in weeks, occupied before midnight. She didn't know that its owner had arrived home at 11:30 after a 17-hour day, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he hadn't touched, and walked out onto the terrace because the open air felt less suffocating than the inside of his own head. She didn't know any of that. Dae-Hyun Nam was 34 years old, and he had not done anything spontaneous since he was 22. He had built Nam Capital Group from a 3-person operation, running out of a Koreatown sublet, into one of the most quietly aggressive real estate and tech investment firms on the West Coast. He had done it through a complete and unsentimental devotion to work. 12 years of 18-hour days, of reading people like balance sheets, of never letting anything cost him more than he had budgeted for it emotionally. He was not a cold man, exactly. He was a sealed one. There was a difference, though most people in his life had stopped looking for it. He saw her the moment she started moving. From the terrace, looking down into the courtyard well, the light of her kitchen on the 7th floor was a warm rectangle in the dark, gold, direct, the kind of light that makes whatever is inside it look chosen. He could see the terracotta wall, the edge of a plant on the windowsill, and her, moving through that gold like the light had been installed specifically for what she was doing. He had seen dancers before. He had attended galas, fundraisers, performances. He knew what technical excellence looked like. This was not that. This was something he didn't have a word for. A woman alone in her kitchen at midnight, dancing for absolutely no one, with the kind of joy that didn't need an audience to be real. He stood at the terrace railing for the full length of whatever she was listening to. When the song ended, she stopped, pressed both hands to her sternum like she was holding something in, then laughed, a silent laugh, the kind that meant the feeling was too large for sound, and padded out of the kitchen frame and out of his sight. Dae-Hyun stood at the terrace railing for another long moment. Then he picked up his whiskey, which had gone warm, and drank it. He didn't sleep well that night. He told himself it was the deal he was closing in the morning. He was very good at telling himself things. They met. If standing in a small metal box while avoiding each other's eyes could be called meeting, 4 days later. Noelle was coming back from a morning class, still in her practice clothes, hair pinned up and starting to come loose on one side, carrying a canvas tote with a cracked water bottle and 2 library books that were overdue by 11 days. She had her phone out, texting her best friend Simone about whether it made sense to apply for the small arts grant she'd found online at midnight, or whether the application process would eat 6 weeks she didn't have. The elevator opened. A man stepped in. She moved to one side without looking up. He moved to the other. The doors closed. She finished her text, dropped her phone into the tote, pushed the hair back from her face, and finally glanced sideways, because the elevator was making a sound it didn't usually make, and she wanted to see if whoever was next to her seemed concerned. He wasn't concerned. He was looking straight ahead, with the focused blankness of someone who had trained himself not to appear to be thinking about anything. She noticed, in the way you notice things without deciding to, that he was very still, not tense, just contained, like all his energy had been redirected inward for some private purpose. He was in a suit, not unusual for the building, but the suit was the kind that had been made for him specifically, which was unusual, and he carried a leather folder under one arm, with the casualness of someone for whom that folder represented approximately $500,000 worth of decisions. She looked back at the elevator doors. The elevator made its sound again. "And it's been doing that since Tuesday," she said. "Not really to him, mostly to the air. I reported it. They said a technician is coming. They did not say which century." There was a pause, the half-second of a person recalibrating from silence to conversation. "I know," he said. "I approved the work order this morning." She glanced over. Something in his voice, dry, uninflected, not quite a joke but in the neighborhood of one, made her look more carefully. She processed that for half a second. You're the owner. Yes. And the elevator has been doing this since Tuesday. The technician comes Thursday. A pause. I own the building. I don't live in it full time. There is occasionally a gap. And yet, she gestured at the elevator in general. The grinding noise chose that moment to repeat itself, perfectly timed. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the place where a smile would go if a smile were something he did readily. And yet, he agreed. The doors opened on 7. They both stepped out. She turned right toward 7B. He turned left toward the elevator bank that served the penthouse floors. She stood at her own door for a moment, key in hand, thinking about nothing in particular. Then she went inside and forgot about it. Except she didn't. Quite. There was something about the way he'd said, and yet, the economy of it. The dry humor tucked inside something that wasn't really humor. That stayed with her in the vague way that small moments sometimes do. Like a song you hear through someone else's window that you can't identify but find yourself humming later. She didn't tell Simone about it. There was nothing to tell. Over the following 3 weeks, she saw him 4 more times. Once at the mailboxes in the lobby, where he was sorting through a thick stack of envelopes with the brisk efficiency of someone sorting data. Once in the parking structure, where she was loading her car with equipment bags for a show, and he was getting into a black car that had materialized to collect him. Once in the laundry room at 7 a.m. on a Sunday, which surprised her. She had not pictured him as someone who did his own laundry. Once again in the elevator, where neither of them spoke, but where she was acutely, inexplicably aware of the exact amount of space between them. His name, she found out from the building's management notice board near the mailboxes, a laminated sheet listing emergency contacts, was Dae-Hyun Nam. Owner. Penthouse. She stood with that for a moment. Owner. The building was his. She spent approximately 45 seconds processing what that meant, before deciding it didn't change anything that mattered, and turning her attention back to the grant application, which she had decided to submit even if it ate 6 weeks she didn't have. What mattered was the company. What mattered was 30. Dae-Hyun Nam. Owner. Penthouse could remain a pleasant ambient mystery. The coffee shop was called Loma. It was on the corner 2 blocks from the Harlow, and it was the kind of place that had decided, firmly and without apology, to do one thing exceptionally well: single-origin pour-overs, 2 rotating pastries from a bakery in Highland Park, and absolutely no ambient playlist. The silence was part of the offering. Noelle had discovered it in January, her first month in the building, and it had become as essential to her weekly routine as rehearsal and sleep. She came on Wednesday and Friday mornings, claimed the small corner table by the window, and worked on the business plan for as long as her coffee lasted. She had been coming to Loma for 10 months before she saw Dae-Hyun there. He was at the counter when she arrived the first time, ordering something in the clipped, decisive way he did everything. No hesitation, no deliberation, as if even coffee preferences had been optimized. He turned to wait for his order and saw her, and the slight recalibration she was starting to recognize moved across his face. She lifted her chin. The universal LA acknowledgement that says, "I see you, we know each other slightly," no further interaction required, and went to the counter to order. But the corner table was taken by a couple sharing a newspaper, and the only other available seat was the small round table near the door, which was directly adjacent to where Dae-Hyun Nam had sat down with his coffee, and apparently a stack of documents he was reading with the intensity of someone who had been given very bad news in very small print. She sat. She opened her laptop. She worked. After about 15 minutes, without looking up from his documents, he said, "The grant deadline is the 20th. She looked at him. He was still reading. "Excuse me?" He turned one page. "The Los Angeles Arts Foundation Emerging Company Grant. The deadline is the 20th of next month. You have time. A small silence. How do you know I'm applying for that? I don't. He looked up then, briefly. But you've been in this coffee shop for the last month with a laptop and a business plan, and the expression of someone calculating how much time they don't have. The LAAF grant is the main one for emerging performing arts companies at your stage. It seemed like a reasonable inference. She stared at him for a long moment. Dae-Hyun Nam, she said. Something changed in his face, microscopic. But there. Dae-Hyun, he said. And then, like the word had more weight than expected. You can call me Dae. Noelle. She tilted her head. How do you know about the LAF grant? Nam Capital Group has been a donor to the foundation for 3 years. She processed that. Nam Capital Group. She had heard the name. It was the kind of name that appeared in the business sections of papers she read occasionally and forgot. Real estate. Tech. Quietly enormous. You're that Nam, she said. I'm the only Nam I know of. She almost laughed. She could feel it, the pull of it, and held it back out of some instinct she couldn't fully explain. Something about this man made her want to be careful, the way you're careful near something that might tip. The application is going fine, she told him. I didn't say it wasn't. You implied I was stressed about the deadline. You have the posture of someone who is stressed about a deadline, he said, returning to his documents. That's an observation, not a criticism. This time she did laugh, just a small one, surprised out of her. He looked up again, and that shadow of a smile crossed his face and stayed a half-second longer than usual. They worked in silence for another 40 minutes. When he stood to leave, he straightened his papers, picked up his coffee cup, and paused. The narrative section, he said. That's where most applications lose it. The financials are always fine. The story of why it needs to exist, that's the harder part. She looked up at him. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. He nodded, one precise, minimal nod, and left. She sat for a while after, not looking at her screen. Then she opened the narrative section of the grant application and started again from the beginning. She wrote for 2 hours. It was the best version she'd produced. She didn't examine why. November arrived the way it always does in LA. Imperceptibly, the city declining to acknowledge the calendar's suggestions. But something had shifted in the Harlow's quiet geometry. Between the 7th floor and the 12th, between the warm terracotta kitchen and the glass-walled penthouse above, subtle as a change in atmospheric pressure. The kind you feel in your ears before you can name it. They were not friends. Noelle was precise with herself about this. They were neighbors who occasionally occupied the same spaces and had arrived, through some wordless negotiation, at a version of mutual acknowledgement that was warmer than strangers and more careful than friends. She had learned, across a series of Wednesday and Friday mornings at Loma, that Dae-Hyun had moved to LA from Seoul at 22 with a business degree, $60,000 of family savings he had been 12 years repaying, and a strategy so specific it had apparently not included any contingency for what to do once the strategy worked. She had learned that he took his coffee without anything, that he read 3 newspapers a day in print because screens at breakfast felt like work, that he had a younger sister in Seoul he called every Sunday morning, and that he had a way of listening, genuinely listening, the way most people don't, that made her feel uncomfortably, pleasantly seen. He had learned that she had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a high school music teacher, and a woman who ran a catering business and danced in her kitchen the same way Noelle did, as if music was a private conversation with something larger than the room. He had learned that she had been dancing since she was 4 years old, that she had a complicated and devoted relationship with the city of Los Angeles, that she was the kind of person who remembered what you mentioned in passing and asked about it 3 weeks later, and that her laugh, the real one, the one she didn't always let all the way out, was the most disarming thing he had encountered in a very long time. He did not examine this last point. He was very good at not examining things. What he could not entirely manage was the moment. Every night he was home before midnight. When he found himself stepping out onto the penthouse terrace before bed. Just for a moment. Just to look down into the courtyard. He told himself it was the view. LA at night from the 12th floor had a specific beauty. The grid of lights, the distant suggestion of the hills, the planes blinking their slow paths toward LAX. It was a reasonable thing to stand on a terrace and look at. The fact that the view he was actually looking at was a warm, terracotta-walled kitchen 7 floors below was something he had gotten very skilled at not saying directly to himself. He saw her dance twice more in November. Once to something fast and percussive that made her movement sharp and complex. A series of isolations and sudden stillnesses that looked, from the terrace 12 floors above, like watching someone argue with the air and win. Once to something he couldn't hear but could feel from the way she moved. Slow, searching, her arms moving through the space around her like she was reading something written in the dark. After the second time, he stood at the terrace railing for a long while after she'd gone. He recognized with the diagnostic clarity that came from years of identifying problems before they became expensive. Falling. He was falling, and he did not know what to do with that, because he had spent 12 years making sure the ground beneath him was concrete. The Saturday that changed things arrived without announcement. Noelle was coming back from a late afternoon rehearsal, arms full of equipment and a rolled-up yoga mat tucked under her chin, trying to find her keys in a bag that had too many pockets. When she reached the lobby and found that the elevator was finally, officially broken, not the grinding sound but actual, total failure. A handwritten sign on the door in the building manager's looped script. 7 flights of stairs. She looked at the stairwell door. She looked at the equipment. I can take those. She turned. Dae-Hyun was standing by the mailboxes, already reaching for the equipment bags. You don't have to. I know. He took them. Simply, without making a performance of it. They walked up 7 flights of stairs together. She to her floor, and he, without a word about the 12 flights that still separated him from his own front door, simply keeping pace with her. On the 4th floor landing, she told him about the piece she was rehearsing, a commission she'd received for a winter showcase, something she was trying to make about her mother's kitchen, about the specific freedom of dancing for no one. On the 5th floor, he told her about his first year in LA, sleeping on a friend's couch in Koreatown, eating from the same Korean BBQ place 4 nights a week because the owner gave him extra rice when he looked underfed. On the 6th floor, they were both slightly short of breath, and she laughed about it, and he laughed too. A real one, not the shadow of one. At her door, he handed back her bags. The piece you're making, he said, about dancing for no one. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, as if choosing between things. I think it'll be extraordinary, he said. Then he turned back toward the stairwell, 5 more floors to go, without making anything of it. She stood at her door for a long moment after his footsteps faded upward. There are things you know before you know them. She had been trained, by 30 months of a relationship, that slowly convinced her not to trust her own instincts, to be suspicious of that knowledge. But standing in the hallway of the 7th floor, still slightly breathless from the stairs and something else she wouldn't name, she knew. She was in real trouble. December arrived, and with it a shift in what had been unspoken. It happened on a Wednesday at Loma, the week before Christmas. The coffee shop had a small wreath above the door, and the kind of holiday music playing that was just far enough away to be ambient rather than intrusive. They had been sitting across from each other for an hour, working in the particular comfortable silence they had arrived at, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. That is itself a form of conversation. She looked up from her laptop and found him watching her. Not furtively, directly, the way he did most things. She held the look. The silence changed. It became the kind of silence that has a shape. What are you thinking? She said. And it wasn't quite a question. He considered. She had learned that he always considered. Never spoke from reflex. Never gave you words that hadn't been chosen. It had taken her a while to stop reading the pauses as distance. Now she understood them for what they were. Respect, actually. The opposite of careless. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I've been careful my entire life about what I allow myself to want." She kept her eyes on his. "And," she said, "and I'm sitting here trying to be careful and finding it." Another pause, briefer, a search for precision, much less effective than usual. She felt her chest do something complicated. She closed her laptop. "Dae, I know what I can offer," he said, before she could continue. "And I know what I can't. I work too much. I've worked too much for so long I don't entirely know who I am without a problem to solve. I'm not," he looked for the word, "easy. I know I'm not easy." "I'm not asking you to be easy," she said. The quietest breath. The room doing its thing around them, coffee machine hissing, distant carol, someone's chair scraping. "I would like," he said, careful as always, "to take you to dinner, not as neighbors, not at this coffee shop." A pause. "If that's something you would want." She looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about the 3-year relationship that had ended with her packing 2 suitcases and a portable bar. She was thinking about the version of herself that had learned to make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort. She was thinking about the grant application, about the company she was building, about 30, about all the reasons this was complicated. She was also thinking about 7 flights of stairs and a man who had taken her bags and told her that something she was building would be extraordinary. "Yes," she said. "That's something I'd want." The dinner was at a small Japanese restaurant in Los Feliz that he had been coming to since his 2nd year in LA, back when he was still sleeping on his friend's couch, when this restaurant was the one place he let himself spend money because the food tasted like something his grandmother made, and he was 23 and homesick in ways he hadn't admitted out loud. He told her this over the first course, which surprised her, because it was more personal than he usually allowed himself to be, and she could see in his face that he was aware of that. She told him about Atlanta, about her mother's kitchen, the real one, the one that had become the inspiration for the commission piece, and about the day she had told her parents she wasn't going to pursue a performance career in a company, but was going to build her own. About her father's long, careful silence, and then, 3 weeks later, an unexpected wire transfer with a note that said, "You know what you're doing. Trust that." She watched Dae-Hyun listen. She had been watched before. She had been admired before. She had not often been listened to like this, like what she was saying was data he was cataloging not to use but to keep, to carry with him. Walking back toward the Harlow, she took his hand. She felt him still for a quarter second. A contained surprise. And then his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that felt like a promise. She did not say what she was thinking, which was, "Don't make this something I regret." Neither did he. But she thought, from the way he held her hand across those 6 blocks, that they might have been thinking the same thing. January, and then February. And then the particular magic of late winter in Los Angeles, when the hills go briefly green and the air has a freshness to it that feels borrowed from somewhere more honest. Dae-Hyun learned what it felt like to have a life outside of work. Not easily. Not without friction. He had built 12 years of architecture around the principle that the company was the point and everything else was overhead, and that architecture didn't come down overnight. But Noelle had a way of simply declining to inhabit the part of his life that was just a performance of busyness. When he canceled plans because of a late call, she said okay, without the edge that contained a message. When he showed up distracted, she didn't fill the silence with noise to pull him back. She waited. And when he surfaced, she was still there. And that was so different from what he was used to that it took him weeks to stop waiting for the catch. He learned the geography of her rhythms, the way she moved through a morning versus a night, the specific quality of her silences after a hard rehearsal versus a good one, the things she said with her hands when words weren't quite enough. He learned that she was braver than she gave herself credit for, and more stubborn than she admitted, and that her capacity for joy was not naive. It was chosen, deliberately, daily, in the face of all the evidence that could have made her otherwise. She learned the Sunday morning calls to his sister Jisoo in Seoul, which he always took in Korean, and which were the one time his voice lost its precision and became something looser and younger. The way he read 3 books going simultaneously, each one for a different time of day, with the same methodical intensity he applied to balance sheets. The fact that he had, at some point in his 20s, made peace with solitude in a way that meant he didn't need to fill space and could therefore be completely present in the spaces he chose to occupy. She found this, once she stopped mistaking it for coldness, to be one of the most intimate things about him. In February, he came to see the winter showcase where she performed the commission piece, the one about her mother's kitchen, about dancing for no one. He sat in the 4th row. She didn't look for him in the audience before she went on, because she had a rule about that. But she knew he was there in the way you know certain things, as a ground beneath your feet. The piece was 12 minutes long. When the lights came up, she found him in the 4th row, and his face, usually so contained, was doing something unguarded. Not distress, not emotion in the performed sense, just openness. The look of someone who has received something they weren't prepared for. Backstage, when he found her, he didn't say much. He took both her hands and held them and looked at her. And what passed between them in that moment didn't need words, and they both knew it. She got the LAF grant in February. The notification email arrived on a Tuesday morning, and she made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, and was completely both. And she called her parents, and she called Simone. And then she took the elevator to the 12th floor, and knocked on the penthouse door, and Dae-Hyun opened it in the middle of a call, took one look at her face, and said into his phone, quietly, without explaining, "I'll call you back," and hung up. He took her face in his hands. She held up her phone, showing him the email. He read it. "The narrative section," she told him. They specifically mentioned the narrative section. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know. You read it. You left it open at Loma," he said. "Twice. I may have read it. Both times." She laughed, pressed her forehead against his shoulder, felt him breathe. "It was the best application I've ever read for that grant," he said, into her hair. "And then I've read 12. She pulled back. "You read 12 grant applications for the foundation. I'm on the selection committee." She stared at him. "You were on the selection committee," she said slowly. "For a grant I applied for, and you didn't. I recused myself from your application the day you told me you were applying. I told them I had a conflict of interest and did not participate in the evaluation in any way." He held her gaze. "You won it on your own, Noelle. I want that to be completely clear." She believed him. She knew him well enough, by February, to know that this was true, not only because he was an honest person, but because he was deeply, almost rigidly fair. Mixing those categories would have been, to him, an integrity failure of the highest order. She also knew him well enough to read what was in his face right now. "You wanted me to get it," she said. "I always knew you would," he said. That was never in question. She kissed him then, the way you kiss someone when you've run out of words for what they mean to you and need another vocabulary. March, April. The Kingston project became real. Not just a journal entry, not just a business plan, an LLC, a lease on a small rehearsal space in Atwater Village, 3 dancers hired on project contracts, a calendar filling up with bookings. She worked 16-hour days that mirrored, in their shape, his own. They started to understand each other better for it, the specific exhaustion and specific satisfaction of building something from scratch, the way the work could fill you and hollow you simultaneously. They talked about this at midnight over takeout containers, in the particular depth of conversation that only arrives after a long day when your defenses are too tired to maintain themselves. In April, he told her that he hadn't gone out onto the terrace to look down at her kitchen without her knowledge, since the night she saw him in the elevator, and something in him had decided it needed to be honest, even with itself. She was quiet for a moment. "How long were you watching?" she asked. "The first night. The full song." He didn't look away. "I don't apologize for it, but I needed you to know." She thought about that. About the night she had danced in her kitchen alone and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely herself. About the idea that someone had seen that, not the performance, not the professional, not the carefully assembled public version, but that. "What did you see?" she asked. He thought about it for a long time. "Someone who knew how to be alive," he said. "When everything around her was dark." She let out a long breath. And that's a lot to put on a woman dancing in her kitchen, from 12 floors up. A beat, then his mouth curved, the real smile, unhidden. "I know." A pause. "I told you I wasn't easy." She took his hand. "No, but I never asked for easy." They were, for a few months, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that doesn't announce itself, but just sits inside every day like a quiet hum, the kind you don't notice clearly until it's gone. The call came on a Thursday in May, at 6:42 in the morning. Noelle was in the kitchen making coffee, not dancing, just moving through the ordinary choreography of morning, when her phone lit up on the counter. Dae. 6:42 in the morning. She answered, and in the first half second before he said a word, just the quality of his breath, the particular silence of someone who had been awake for a very long time, holding something he hadn't yet said out loud, she knew that something had changed. She found out the shape of it in pieces over the following 48 hours. The way you find out things when someone is managing information, and their own fear simultaneously. The broad outlines. Marcus Shea, who had been Nam Capital Group's senior partner for 7 years, and the architect of its most significant real estate deals, had been running a parallel operation for the last 3 of those years. Not illegal, which was, in some ways, worse. Entirely legal, entirely deliberate, and structured in such a way that if Shea exited the firm, which he was now threatening to do, taking 4 of their largest institutional clients, the resulting damage to Nam Capital's balance sheet would be catastrophic. Not fatal, but the kind of wound that reshaped things. The kind that required immediate, total response. "What does total response mean?" she asked him, on Saturday morning, when he finally stopped moving long enough to sit. A silence. His hands flat on the table. The gesture she had learned meant he was choosing words carefully and needed a moment. "There are 2 options," he said. "I negotiate a settlement with Shea, and we restructure. 6 months of very difficult work, most of it here. Or," he stopped. "Or, Seoul. I go to Seoul, I meet with the institutional investors directly, I rebuild those relationships in person. That can't be done remotely. Those are relationships built on physical presence, on hierarchy, on being in the room. If I'm not there, they interpret it as weakness." She was very still. "How long?" she said. He didn't answer right away. That told her. "Dae. How long?" "Minimum 6 months," he said. Possibly a year. The room had a weight in it that it hadn't had before. And the other option? Negotiate here? "We survive it," he said. "But we lose the scale we've built. We come out smaller. It buys time, but not position." She looked at him. She understood, in this moment, what the next weeks would look like, because she could see it already in the way he was sitting. She could see the familiar architecture reassembling itself around him. The walls, the precision, the retreat into the problem. She could see him calculating, And she could see that in the calculus, the risk of losing the company was being weighed against everything else. And she could see, in the specific quality of his silence, which way it was leaning. "You've already decided," she said. His eyes came up to hers. "I haven't. Dae." She kept her voice even. "I know how you decide things. You think through all the variables first, and then you present it as still in progress. But you've decided." A long silence. "The company is everything I've built," he said. 12 years, every dollar, every decision, every... He stopped, ran a hand across his jaw. "I can't lose it. Not like this. Not to him." She understood. She did not, on some level, even argue with it. She had spent 2 years building something of her own. She knew what it meant to look at something you'd made from nothing and feel that it was a piece of you that you could not afford to let someone else take. But understanding is not the same as being okay. "When?" she said. 3 weeks. She nodded slowly. She stood. She walked to the window. She walked to the city below stretched out in every direction. The particular vastness of LA from the 12th floor. The courtyard a tiny square of olive trees far below. The Harlow's tenants living their small, ordinary lives beneath them. "I need you to hear something," she said, without turning around. "You have every right to make this choice. I mean that. But I need you to also hear that 3 weeks is very little time to figure out whether what we have can survive that kind of distance for that kind of duration. And I need you to know," her voice was steady and she kept it that way, "that I will not wait indefinitely. I have a company to build. I have a life here. I will not put my life on hold while you rebuild yours from the other side of the world." Silence. "I'm not asking you to." "Good." She turned around. "But you're not hearing me. I'm not saying I won't wait, Dae. I'm saying you need to decide whether you're leaving for 6 months or whether you're leaving, because those are different." He looked at her. The contained quality was back, the seal, but she could see something underneath it that was frightened and honest, and exactly the thing she had fallen in love with. "I don't want to leave," he said. "That's not the same thing as deciding to stay." 3 weeks was not enough time. They both knew it, and neither said it directly. What happened instead was a combination of closeness and quiet withdrawal, the way people love harder when they know something is ending, but also begin the work of bracing. The farewell dinner at his grandmother's favorite restaurant in Koreatown. The Sunday morning she woke up and heard him on the phone with Jisoo in Seoul, his voice doing its younger, looser thing, and she lay there and listened and felt the physical reality of an ocean preparing to exist between them. The day he left, they stood in the lobby of the Harlow with his luggage, and very little said. She had decided, somewhere in the last week, that she was not going to perform the movie version of this. She was not going to say "don't go" or "I'll wait" or something that would give either of them a false architecture. She held his face in her hands, the way he had held hers on the day of the grant. "Build what you need to build," she said. "Noelle, go," she said, "and then come back knowing what you want." He kissed her. She let him. Then he left. She stood in the lobby for a while after the car had gone. Then she walked up the 7 flights of stairs to her floor. She had gotten into the habit long before the elevator broke, and she kept it now. And went into her apartment, into her kitchen, turned on the light, and stood in the gold of it for a long time. Then she put on a song and danced, for herself, because that had always been what she did. The summer was harder than she expected, which she had expected. She told herself the business was the answer, and it was. The Kingston project consumed her in the way that only building something from nothing can. By June, she had a company of 5 dancers and a schedule of 6 performances across the fall season. By July, she had been written up in 2 arts publications and offered a residency at a theater in Silver Lake that would take her through the following spring. Simone, who had been there through the packing of the 2 suitcases, the move, the rebuilding, and every version of Noelle in between, came to visit in July and stood in the rehearsal space in Atwater Village and looked around at what her best friend had built and said, without preamble, "Girl, just that. Girl." And Noelle had laughed and said, "I know," and that was all that needed saying. By August, she was doing exactly what she had told herself she would do at 29. She was building, growing, becoming. It was real, and it was satisfying, and it was also true that she fell asleep some nights and looked up at the ceiling and thought about a penthouse 12 floors above her with no light on the terrace, and felt the shape of what was missing in a way that was located somewhere below words. They talked. Not every day. They'd decided that wasn't the shape they wanted. Both of them understanding that daily calls in the context of 2 people who communicated primarily in presence and proximity would make the distance worse, not better. But 3 times a week, and on Sundays, and when something happened that felt incomplete without the other person knowing. She told him about the residency, about the dancer she'd hired, who was making the company something more than she'd imagined, about the night of their first fall performance when the theater was full and the lights went down, and she stood in the wings and felt, for the first time, that the dream had a body. He told her about Seoul, not the business, not the strategy, but the city itself, which he was seeing differently now. He told her about going back to the neighborhood where he'd grown up, about having dinner with his parents for the first time in 4 years, about Jisoo's new apartment and the way his sister had looked at him and said, "You seem different, Appa," and he hadn't known how to answer. She noticed, across those months, that his sentences had gotten longer, that there was more contingency in how he spoke, more acknowledgement of what he didn't know. The precision was still there. It was structural. It was him. But it had loosened slightly around the edges, as if the last year had given it a little more room. She did not let herself draw too much from this. She had been careful with her hope before, in other contexts, and knew its cost when mishandled. August turned to September. September turned to October, the anniversary, she noticed, of the night she had danced in her kitchen, not knowing that someone 12 floors above her was standing on a terrace in the dark, watching the realest thing he'd seen in years. He called on October 14th. She hadn't mentioned the date. Neither had he, consciously. But he called. "I know what day it is," he said. A long, warm pause. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what you told me before I left." "Which part?" "Go and then come back knowing what you want." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what I want, Noelle. I've known for longer than I've admitted. But knowing what I want and knowing how to be the person who deserves it, those aren't the same thing. And I think for a long time I was using the company as a reason not to close that gap." She was very still. The light in her kitchen was on. It was 9 at night in LA, which made it 1 in the afternoon in Seoul. "And now," she said. "I'm closing the gap," he said. "I don't know how long it takes, but I'm doing it." She didn't say what she wanted to say, which was, "Hurry up." She didn't say, "I miss you in a way that takes up space I need for other things." She said, "I'm glad." "There's something else," he said. Marcus Shea accepted the settlement terms. "The restructuring is almost complete. I could come home in November." "Could. But," she said, because she could hear the but. "But I'm choosing to stay through December, because Jisoo is—" He stopped. Started again. She's been going through something hard, and I haven't been present for my family in a long time, and I think—" Another pause. And she could hear him choosing carefully, choosing honestly. "I think part of being the person I want to be is staying when I don't strictly have to. Not leaving the moment the business reason dissolves." She closed her eyes. She had been 29 when they met. She was 30 now. She had built her company. She had made herself real. She was not waiting. She had kept her word to herself about that, had lived fully and with intention across these 6 months, had not placed her life in suspension. But she felt, in this moment, something settle in her. Something she had been holding very carefully, at arm's length, in case it turned out to be made of the wrong material. "December," she said. "December," he said. "And then I'm coming home. If that's a breath. If that's still something." She thought about a woman dancing in a kitchen. She thought about a man in the dark, who'd looked at her and seen someone who knew how to be alive. "Come home, Dee," she said. He came back on December 19th. She did not go to the airport. They had not discussed this. But she understood, as she understood most things about them by now, that arriving home, walking through the door of his apartment, setting his bags down, standing in his own space, was something he needed to do first, alone. A returning was required before a reuniting. She was at the theater when he landed. The company's closing night performance of their fall season, a full house, the best show they'd done, the dancers at the peak of what they'd built together across those months. She stood in the wings and watched the last piece, the one about her mother's kitchen, which she had performed herself in February, but which was now danced by 2 of her company members and had become, in the reinterpretation, something that contained her original intention, but expanded it into something larger. She watched it and felt full in the way she had learned to feel, not in spite of the difficulty of the year, but because of it, because everything she was watching had been built through it. After the show, after the company had dispersed into the night, she walked home. 6 blocks. The December air had the particular Los Angeles quality of being cool, but not cold. The city performing a version of winter that was really just a loosening of summer. She walked into the Harlow. The elevator, a fact she registered with a familiar mix of irritation and fondness, was making its noise again. She took the stairs. At the 7th floor landing, she stopped, put her hand on the door to her own hallway, then looked up the remaining stairwell. 5 more flights. She kept walking up. At the 12th floor, she stepped into the small penthouse landing. The light beneath the door was on. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then she knocked. He opened the door. He looked, she registered this before anything else, different in small, significant ways. Less sealed, not opened exactly, but breathing differently. The way a house looks when someone has been living in it after a period of standing empty. He looked at her for a long moment. "You walked," he said. 6 blocks. I do it all the time." "How was the show?" "Perfect," she said, and meant it simply. He stepped back from the door. She came in. The apartment was the same. Precise, spare, the kind of clean that came from careful living rather than performance. But there were small new things. A photograph on the shelf she didn't recognize. Soul in it. His family's neighborhood. A book by the window she'd seen him mention in a call. Evidence of a person who had, quietly, been living elsewhere and was now bringing that life home. She sat on the couch. He brought 2 glasses of water, a quietly D gesture, practical and caring simultaneously, and sat across from her. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "I spent 12 years treating my emotional life as overhead," he said. "Something to be minimized. I was wrong. Not because it was a failed strategy. In terms of building the company, it worked. But because a life isn't a company, and applying the same model doesn't produce the same results. What it produces is exactly what I had before you. An extremely functional, completely empty structure." She watched him. "I don't know how to be easy," he continued. "I suspect I never will be. I will always work harder than most people. I will have Sundays that are mostly work, and nights that end too late, and problems that need my whole mind. I'm not offering you something uncomplicated." "I know what you're offering," she said. I need you to hear the whole thing before you decide. Dae. She leaned forward slightly. I have listened to you very carefully for more than a year. I know every version of you. The version that watches someone dance in a kitchen and can't look away. The version that reads grant applications he's not allowed to vote on. The version that stays in Seoul an extra month for his sister when the business reason is already gone. I know you. He was very still. And I'm telling you, not from need, not from longing, not from the version of love that requires someone to be different from who they are, that what you're offering is exactly what I want. If you can give me the real version, not the performance of closeness, the actual thing, a long, quiet, I don't know how to do anything halfway, he said. I know, she said. And that's what I'm counting on. Something shifted in his face, the final layer of the seal, the last piece of the architecture that had been keeping everything at a calculated distance. And then he was simply present, entirely and without protection, in a way she had glimpsed before, but never seen, held without flinching. He moved to sit beside her on the couch. She took his hand the way she had taken it on the night of their first walk home, simply as a choice. There's something I need to tell you, he said, about the night I first saw you. I know, she said. You told me. Not that. He was quiet for a moment. When I saw you dancing, before I knew anything about you, I made an assumption about what your life was like, that it was easy, or full, or uncomplicated, that the joy I was watching was the result of everything going right. She looked at him. And then I found out the truth of it, he said. And the 3 weeks late on rent, the relationship that had made you smaller, the years of building something with no guarantee, all of it. He looked at their joined hands. And what I saw that night, that full, real aliveness, wasn't because things were easy. It was because you chose it anyway. You chose it in spite of everything that could have made you otherwise. She felt something in her chest do its complicated thing. That's not a small thing, he said. What you carry. The choice you make every day to still be that way. I want you to know I see it. All of it. Not just the part that looks beautiful from a window. She looked at him for a long moment. Dae-Hyun Nam, she said quietly. Yes. You are the most careful person I have ever known, and you are also the most... She looked for the word, found it earnest. That combination should not work as well as it does. Something warm moved across his face. The full smile, not the shadow of one, the real thing. I'm still learning, he said. Me too, she said. Outside, Los Angeles was doing its late December thing, cool and golden, the hills lit with holiday lights, the city performing its own version of peace. In apartment 7B, the light was on, terracotta warm. In 7A, for the first time in months, someone was home. On the small shelf in 7A, between the photograph from Seoul and the book she'd recommended, was a journal, new, not yet filled. He had bought it in Seoul, in October, because Jisoo had told him that the thing that had changed about him was that he seemed to be paying attention now, and he had wanted a place to put what he was paying attention to. The first entry said only, October 14th. She's still there, still dancing. So am I. Now. Learning how. 6 months later, June, the Kingston project staged its first full-length evening. Not a showcase, not a commissioned piece, not a program of shorter works, but a 90-minute production called Still Here, which Noelle had been building in her mind for 3 years, and in the rehearsal room in Atwater Village for the last 8 months. 7 dancers, 3 original scores commissioned from composers she had met through the residency. A set design that consisted almost entirely of light. The theater was full every night of its 3-week run. The Los Angeles Times ran a review that used the phrase, one of the most accomplished debuts by an emerging choreographer this decade, which she read standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, and then set her phone down and stood very still for a long time because she was 30, and she had built this, and she needed a moment to let that be real. Dae-Hyun was in the audience on opening night, 4th row, same seat as before. After the show, he found her backstage. He held both her hands. He looked at her. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. That was all. It was entirely sufficient. Nam Capital Group had completed its restructuring by March. Smaller than before, leaner, as he put it, which was not a loss but a correction. A return to the scale that matched his actual vision rather than the scale he'd been chasing because the momentum of growth had its own gravity. He had renegotiated their approach to institutional investors, had hired a new partner who turned out to be, in several ways, better at certain things than Marcus Shea had been, and had made one significant personal change. He blocked Sundays. Not always successfully, but the intention was structural now. Sundays were for other things. For the farmers' market in Silver Lake, where he had discovered he had opinions about stone fruit. For Noelle's rehearsals when she invited him to watch, which she did sometimes, not always, because the work was hers, and she was protective of its process in the right ways. But sometimes, and when she did, he sat in the corner of the rehearsal space and watched with the same total attentiveness he brought to everything. And occasionally she could feel, in the middle of working out a section that wasn't landing, that there was someone in the corner who understood exactly what she was trying to do. Jisoo visited in April. She and Noelle got along in the way Noelle had half expected, which was immediately, and honestly, and with a kind of sisterly candor that included Jisoo looking at her brother across a restaurant table and saying, "You look like a person now, not a machine," which Dae-Hyun received without argument, which told Noelle everything about how far he'd come. On a Tuesday in June, the week before the run of Still Here ended, Noelle was in her kitchen making tea. Late evening, the city outside doing its thing. She was barefoot on the tile. She put on a song, the same slow R&B song she'd been playing on October 14th, 2 years ago, the night that started everything. She closed her eyes. She started to dance. Not for anyone. Not because of anything. Just because the music was living in her chest, and movement was the oldest form of self-conversation she knew. After a while, she opened her eyes. Dae-Hyun was standing in the kitchen doorway, not on a terrace 12 floors above, not looking down from a distance, but here, in her kitchen, in her space, his tie loosened and a cup of tea in his hand, watching her with the exact same expression she had seen on his face, in a different context, in a different November, the first time she had ever looked directly back at him. "Sorry," he said. The door was unlocked. He stopped. I didn't want to interrupt. She kept swaying slightly. Wind-down movement, the song still going. "You're not interrupting," she said. He set down his tea. He crossed the kitchen, and she shifted to make room, and he put one hand at her waist, careful, and asking permission quality to it even now after everything. And she put her hand against his chest, and they moved together. Not dancing exactly. Something slower and less choreographed. Two people in a warm kitchen at the end of a long day, holding each other in a way that didn't need a name. The song ended. They stayed still. "You know," she said, into his shoulder, "you're significantly better at this than you were in February." "Jisoo made me take a class," he said. "In Seoul. Do not ask me about it." She laughed. The full one, the real one, the one she hadn't always let all the way out. She felt him breathe it in. Outside, the Los Angeles night was doing what it always did, offering itself as a version of beauty that didn't require you to believe in it to receive it. The courtyard below was quiet. The olive trees moved. In apartment 7B, the light was on, terracotta gold, warm and particular. 12 floors above, the penthouse terrace stood empty and dark for the first time in 2 years. Because the man who once stood there alone, looking down, was no longer looking from a distance. He was here. He had seen her first, from a terrace in the dark, looking down into a gold-lit kitchen 7 floors below. He had seen something alive and unguarded and completely itself, and it had undone him in a way that 12 years of armor had not prepared him for. She had seen him back. Not what she was supposed to see. Not the power, not the precision, not the impressive architecture of a life built entirely from will. She had seen the sealed man, and then slowly, the man inside the seal. And she had decided, with the same clear-eyed courage with which she decided everything, that he was worth the work of knowing fully. They were not a simple story. They were not the version where love was enough on its own, where feeling was the whole answer. They were the version where two people who had both, in different ways, been living inside their own carefully constructed architectures, recognized something in each other, and had the courage to keep showing up, not because it was easy, but because they were choosing it. Every day, eyes open. The kitchen was warm. The song had ended. They were still holding each other. "Stay," she said. He pulled back slightly, looked at her face. "I was already going to," he said. And he did. On the shelf in the penthouse, between the photograph from Seoul and the book she had recommended, was a journal, new, not yet filled. He had bought it in Seoul in October, because Jisoo had told him that what had changed about him was that he seemed to be paying attention now. He had wanted a place to put what he was paying attention to. The first entry said only, October 14th. She's still there, still dancing. So am I, now. Learning how,